all right? But we're gonna suspend right now any kind of look at doing this question, and maybe we'll have time for some of it tomorrow, just to again kind of begin to consider. Okay, here's a party period. These are the two parties. Here's what who led them. Here's the basic platforms of the parties. And what I think is most important is what's the catalyst? Why did that particular period of time, the parties of that particular period of time go into decline? Why did new parties emerge? So the catalyst for change. And we can do some of that kind of quickly with, where we're at. Right? Because, we'll do this real quickly. If we start with the first party system and the Federalists and the Democrats, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, what's the issue that makes the Federalists go away? What do they get on the wrong side of?
War of 1812.
Right? So because of the War of 1812, they get on the wrong side of things. They look bad, especially since we go into the era of good feelings where everything is great. And we have the demise of essentially the Federalist parties. And we have essentially kind of, within the same party, multiple candidates, running. And this explains the catalyst for the emergence of the new, second party system here. Because we have multiple candidates running. We have the four-way tie. We have the corrupt bargain. And we have the bitterness of the people's voice perhaps not being heard. And it leads to the emergence of the Jacksonian Democrats, who, again, are seen as being the defenders of, expanded democracy, but more likely they're the benefactors of expanded democracy. Because what you see with Andrew Jackson when he's a president is really kind of an autocrat. Someone who uses the veto extensively, someone who threatens to use force when the states bring up the idea of the nullification theory again, that they have a right to nullify state acts. You see it in part in his Indian removal policies. This idea of a kind of, a person exercising executive power as unilaterally and as aggressively as possible, all right? So for that reason, we have the emergence, and this is where we left off yesterday, of the Whigs. Now, if the name sounds funny, it's because, again, they took it from a British political party that was opposed to King George, in part because King George was going mad. There was a bout of insanity within the royal family at this point. There's probably multiple ones, but this is a rather well-documented one. So what they liked was the parallel. The Whigs in Britain were opposed to a arguably insane king. We're opposed to arguably kind of, I don't know if you'd call him insane, but the guy dueled left and right, had shot in his arm, and ritually kind of did some bloodletting. Guy would shoot you if you crossed him. They liked that parallel. Jackson was nicknamed King Andrew. And there's all kinds of, I don't know if you recognize, all kinds of political cartoons portraying him as thus. All right? So that's where the Whigs come from. Now, ideologically, they're not just, they are there as a kind of an oppositional party due to Jackson, but, in general, they oppose, expanded federal, they're opposed to Jackson, but they are in support of the idea of using an active federal government to promote infrastructure, to promote manufacturing, commercial, and financial interests. They're not going to be around for long because, again, what's going to happen is we're going to get into that period of time where the issue of slavery is going to begin to divide the nation. And force a reformation of the parties. The parties are going to have to address that issue, and you can kind of see from the positions of the two parties I mentioned, they really don't. And consequently, we have the third party system and the emergence of the Republican Party. And what they are is they're an amalgam. they, absorb the Whigs. They absorb, all kinds of groups, Northerners, progressive whites. There's a Liberty Party. There's a Free Soil Party. They kind of scoop up a lot of these minor parties and other groups around the issue of slavery. Now, you can argue the idea that the Republican Party and Lincoln himself had an evolution in terms of his position on slavery. If you look at him initially, he doesn't like the institution, but he's not necessarily for the abolishment of the institution. He's against the expansion of the institution. That's the Free Soil kind of party. But eventually, his position evolves. Some of it has to do with, I think there's a timing to it. When he sees an opportunity to go beyond a narrow position and really work actively for its abolishment, he seizes that opportunity. What a lot of people forget is his work in getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment passed, and he strided in those cases. At any rate, the Republican Party is initially, and I want you to remember this because there's going to be a lot of swings in the South around the Republican Party, and a lot of swings with African Americans. You can obviously understand that African Americans would gravitate towards the Republican Party. Today, that's not as much the case. Southerners would, see this as, especially in the Confederate and Reconstruction period, see the Republican Party as a party they don't identify with, and yet today in the South that's flip-flopped. So kind of, you need to hold on to the history of the Republican Party to understand those kind of switches. And by the way, I use this as an excuse to get in some of the terminology. We know that both the Democrats and Republicans basically identify with Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, and they kind of claim that part of the label. But have you ever heard of the Republican Party referred to as the GOP? Anybody know what it stands for? A lot of people within the GOP who are diehard adherents don't know what the GOP stands for. Alex, what is it? Grand Old Party or Gallant Old Party? Does anybody know the origins of that? It's actually a derisive kind of term, and it was one attached to them by the Democrats. The Democrats are the oldest, longest standing party. They had been around for some 32 years or 22 years prior to the formation of the Republican Party. And so when this new party came about, after the Whigs and the Free Soil and the Liberty Party, they kind of were jokingly talking about, look at this grand or gallant old party. The name stuck. Within the Republican Party, they kind of debate about holding on to it. Does anybody know why the symbols of the donkey and the elephant? It largely came about because of Thomas Nast. You know Thomas Nast? He's the guy that brought down Tammany Hall, essentially. Marcy Tweed, the corrupt party boss, was so mad at Thomas Nast because he said, I don't care what the papers write. My constituents can't read, but they can understand pictures. Essentially Thomas Nast brought down that party machine. He is a very influential political cartoonist who did cartoons that began to portray the Democrats as the donkey. And, what's interesting is, a mule, a donkey, an ass is considered kind of a stubborn beast. But there's other positive sides. So initially, Jackson was kind of compared to the donkey, and then he said, no, loyal, trustworthy, hardworking. They kind of, again, may have started as a bit of a negative, but they co-opted and took it as a positive. You see a lot of political, there's Jackson riding it, and apparently beating it with a stick, as is his, And then later on, you get cartoons with the Republicans being represented by the elephant. And again, there was initially, the classic example, the elephant being afraid of a mouse and becoming, deranged as a result, or, long-term memory, powerful, strong. They kind of co-opted the aspects they liked of it in terms of positive, even though some tried to spin it as negative. Somewhat of a tangent, but that's where the symbols come from. At any rate, the Civil War and the issue of slavery explains the kind of the rise of the Republican Party, and in part it explains the demise of the Democratic Party. because they get essentially, split by this issue. Um, there's factions within the Democratic Party that are against slavery and look to bring about its abolition, and are on one side when it comes to the Civil War, and there's the other side that isn't. Again, it's in part because you've got within the Democratic Party at this point an alliance that no longer works of Southern farmers and Westerners, and that geography isn't going to work anymore given this kind of new issue. Consequently, after the Civil War, what you see is Republican domination as we go into this kind of fourth party system. The Republicans evolve a little bit. The issue of slavery isn't as central of an issue anymore. But what they do is they get on the side of kind of pro-business policies. They dominate elections for 36 years. The Democrats become more of a regional party. They're trying to keep control of the South and the West, and that means, agricultural policies, especially since they've gone kind of the pro-business side. But what both sides are trying to do is use party machines. There's a wave of immigration. The new immigrants coming to America are in need of support and services, and party machines did this. They handed out jobs. They would provide means to a meal. They would help find housing and things like that. And as they did these kind of things, it was a little bit of a quid pro quo. Here is food, clothing, and shelter, and income, and in exchange, I want votes. And so it didn't really matter the politics. If the Democrats helped the Irish are going to be lifelong Democratic voters, right? And it becomes kind of generational. If the Republicans help an influx of Germans, then the Germans are going to be lifelong kind of Republican voters until some sort of new issue causes maybe a division. At any rate, the party machines kind of kept the Democratic Party viable, but both sides are doing it. The interesting thing to think about is when FDR comes along, the spoils system was one reason why the parties were really powerful, and that begins to go away prior to FDR. But when the government begins to provide the services as part of social services, the party machines again go away. I don't have the spoils system anymore. I don't have the ability to hand out benefits. The government's now doing that. It explains the demise of the party machines that, aren't great institutions, but they did, they did provide services at a minimum. At any rate, what's the catalyst to get away from the fourth party system? Well, it's the Great Depression. We've got the pro-business kind of party that is failing in the eyes of many to, meet the needs, the overwhelming needs of the Great Depression, right? Hoover, in particular, the Republican president. What do we nickname the shanty towns that people are living in? Hoovervilles, right? He gets a lot of the blame because he's not fixing things. Feels that the economy is going to be cyclical and it will correct itself. The other thing that works against the Democratic Party is the coalition that FDR is going to be able to put together. This New Deal coalition, which is an amalgam. The Democratic Party, when you look at it, you wonder, gosh, what holds these different groups together? Because you've got Southerners and urban working class individuals. And what unified them at that point was, poverty, the ravages of the Great Depression. You've got union members, and new ethnic groups, African Americans, Catholics, Jews. The Democratic coalition still holds on to these groups. But when you look at them in terms of, are union members likely to be more socially conservative? I mean, there's an argument for that. Yet they're going to align with the Democratic Party because of its historic support of labor, right? Again, you're going to see African Americans start to get pulled over to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party history was the one that ended slavery. And yet there's a correlation, obviously, between income and race. that because of institutional discrimination, African Americans, struggled historically more with income, and therefore are going to identify maybe more with the party that brings relief, right? So at any rate, this is the catalyst for the resurgence of the Democratic Party, and they're going to redefine themselves. They're not just a regional party that is looking to promote southern and western interests along the lines of agriculture. They're looking to make government the safety net for social ills through demand side or Keynesian economics. Remember the whole idea of if private spending isn't keeping the kind of the engines of and the wheels of the economy turning, we'll supplement it with deficit spending. We'll do kind of made up work. All right. In contrast, you have the Republicans, seen as pro-business still looking for that reduced role of government in the marketplace, and not having a tremendous amount of success. Within this span of 36 years, you've only got one Republican president, and that's Dwight Eisenhower. And it probably doesn't have to do as much with the pro-business policies or the label of Republican. Why is Dwight Eisenhower, president? If he ran as an independent, why would he be president? Who is Dwight Eisenhower? What was he before he was a president, Alex? Yeah, a wartime hero, wartime general, wartime hero. So, it may kind of influence how you see, the break in Democratic dominance during this period. At any rate, it flip-flops again. And in part, I don't have it down as a catalyst, but what I would speculate, because it's funny, the texts, if you look at them, they're like, is this the six-party system, or are we still kind of in the fifth-party system? I think they're just looking to create, new textbooks and jobs for themselves. They love federal, periods of federalism and periods of political parties, because that's questions on the test, right? But I do think we are in a different period, because the pendulum was that government did more and more increasingly. FDR was the architect of the modern welfare state, and it became the safety net for a wide range of social ills. And then comes LBJ, and he's looking for the Great Society, and he's looking to expand what the federal government is doing, and he's looking to do it in perhaps a more coercive fashion. We're going to right the issues of poverty. We're going to right the problems in terms of racial injustice, and we're going to kind of fix the ills of cities, right? And so there is a bit of a pendulum that swings back as people look to say, I want government doing a little bit less, not more. That government is the problem, not the solution. The government that governs the least governs the best, right? Because when you look at the history of the presidency, during this time period, Republican Party wins 7 out of the 10 presidencies. Each of them trying to return power to the states, and as we've studied, each with kind of, arguably a failed success at that. You can argue about that. The two Democrats that do come in after LBJ are Carter and Clinton. Some would argue that they're kind of centrist candidates. Clinton definitely did come to the center, but a lot of that had to do with the Republican sweep of '94. Carter does look for areas of compromise. Both did look for areas of compromise. So you can kind of debate that in your own right. But at any rate, the Republicans during this time period, up through the 2000s, dominated the presidency. And yet what you see in the House is Democrats basically having majority control within the House, with the exception in '94, that Republican sweep. When the wave that was kind of characterizing the presidency began to prompt people to decide to overthrow their incumbents, right? So what this leads to, this period is incredibly important, because what you see in front of you are 3 questions on divided government. That packet that I handed you with the 3 questions, take a look at it real quick. Just read the questions. So divided government is a really simple concept. All it is where one party controls the White House and the other party controls Congress, or one party controls the House of Representatives, the other party controls the Senate. And in years past, that was it. I breezed past it. And yet, you can see the AP board, man, do they love them some divided government. Because there are, I suppose, more interesting analytical issues at play there. The big question is divided government good or bad? You know, that's essentially what these questions are looking at. What are the pros and cons of it? Now, on a simple level, what you would think is divided government, where I've got institutions controlled by different parties, slows things down. It causes, and here's my terminology, gridlock. Remember that traffic terminology where, you know, because people aren't being considerate and they go when the light is yellow and they get in the middle of the intersection and they block the other lane from being able to go. And once that happens, traffic is frozen. Well, we use that analogy to describe Congress, that on the surface level, it must lead to gridlock. It must lead to a situation where no legislation gets passed. It must lead to a situation, and this is, again, picture questions where you have to kind of talk about the tangible impact. You got to go beyond gridlock, right? Okay, so there's no legislation being passed. The Senate is using its power of advice and consent to thwart. You know, we're not getting treaties kind of passed. We're not getting nominations passed. We could also look at the idea of the House using its, and the Senate using its investigatory powers as in an adversarial way, that we're going to put the executive branch under the microscope, or executive agencies under the microscope, out of sheer politics as opposed to any need for investigation, right? Counterbalance that with the executive branch using the veto, using executive orders, using signing statements, using executive agreements instead of treaties, and fast-tracking things, and doing recess appointments, right? That's what the conventional wisdom would suggest. But if you look at the studies, it would indicate that all of those variables that I just talked about kind of stay consistent. That the percentage of legislation passed when there's a divided Congress is about the same as when there's a unified government, right? The number of vetoes exercised, about the same. The time it takes for kind of appointments and the number of appointments that go through, about the same. So it can go in either direction, but to mine it down on a different level, if it is the same, is there a kind of a difference in terms of the character of legislation? All right, you're getting legislation passed, but it's shoddy legislation because you've had to compromise it to a point where it's watered down. That, yeah, appointments are being made, but the stalling tactics are huge. Treaties are being passed, but it's because of executive agreements and fast tracking. So you can see, because it's so complicated, that's, I think, in part why they love it. Because you can look at gridlock and you can look at exactly what isn't happening, but then you can flip it and say, here's another level to look at. If these things are happening, let's look at the quality of what's happening. Let's look at the timing of what's happening, right? Now, the other thing that they like is the idea of party polarization. And again, this is something I could mention in a sentence and breeze past and never come back to. And yet I've seen a ton of questions on this. And the concepts are easy to mix up. Party polarization is where people begin within a party to go to the ideological extremes, right? And you can see it within the Republican Party in particular right now, where the Tea Party is pulling the Republican Party from the center, and it's making it hard for them to govern in some ways, because if they're not kind of voting as a unified bloc, they've got to work harder at cobbling together a coalition. Within the Democratic Party, around universal health care, there was a more liberal contingent that kind of tried to pull the party to the left, and it made passing universal health care difficult, because what they wanted was universal health care. They wanted it to be more universal, as opposed to having kind of different categories of people qualify for different programs and other groups kind of being exempt, so on and so forth. All right. So party polarization seems to be the thing that has more impact on governing than divided government. It makes it more hard to pass legislation. It means it's more likely that vetoes are going to happen. It means it's more likely that advice and consent will be used in a kind of adversarial way. Okay, so you got to get that concept down as well. Kind of leads you demoralized, right? Because either I'm in gridlock, or I've got party polarization that's kind of screwing us up. What a dysfunctional bunch. A third thing to consider is whether or not any of this is as bad as we think. Because, if I pulled up the timeline of presidencies from George Herbert Walker Bush, it goes Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. We alternate between Democrats and Republicans since 1989. And then when you look at the balance of Congress, when you look at the balance within the states, there's a lot to suggest that even though there's party polarization happening and there's divided government, that we as a populace are more mainstream than we think. And again, the electoral map really skews things. Because when you look at it, it's red and blue states. And man, what a dysfunctional bunch we are. We can't agree on things. But again, as you zoom in, we'll go to a relatively, you begin to see that it's, as I go county by county, you're going to see that we're not just, I colored the map all in one color. That Virginia was blue, but when I zoom in, it looks more red than blue, right? Norfolk, Richmond, Roanoke. Anybody know what kind of places those are? Populated places, big cities, right? And so, I kind of see this contrast between, somewhat rural and somewhat populated areas. If I zoomed in even further, what you begin to get, whoops, didn't want to zoom in that far. Oh, I lost it. I got like 2 minutes and I lost it. All right. What you see is that we're not red, we're not blue, we're purple. And there are electoral maps that show you the difference in a state and how close it is. And these maps actually kind of shaded it based on how close things were. That screen does a little better job. We're purple. All right? Remember, we're purple. So tomorrow we go into the impact of third parties. And that's when your outlines of the Nader Party will be helpful. Okay?
Bobby Webster.
Yeah, if you leave them at the desk, because we're going to look at those tomorrow.